little chilly today. You hear a little humming in the background. That's a diesel heater keeping things nice and toasty warm. But today in this episode I thought we'd talk about power, sails, the engines, and some of the electronics and the DC power. Now the main power under sail, that is, when there's enough wind and not too much, is my 160% Genoa and my mainsail. I planned on hoisting those up so you could see them, but you know what they are. We got 35 knot gust winds today. I don't think I'm raising them, especially tied at the pier. That's just dangerous. But for engine power, I've got a Yanmar, the 2GM. I think it's 16 horsepower. And it's pretty new. It was new when I got the boat 9 years ago. It doesn't have a engine hour gauge, so I'm not sure how many hours are on it. I try to track that a little bit, change the oil at least once a year, sometimes twice if I've really been doing a lot with it. You know, check the fuel filter. And since I have, and we'll get into this in just a minute, since I've cleaned out and revamped the fuel tank 3 years now, I haven't had a problem with the fuel filter. Now, and I've mentioned this in a couple other videos, a couple years ago, and I guess it was in 2022, I had to replace the mixing elbow, so that's new on the boat, the fuel pump, or the water pump, and I'm going to rebuild the old water pump so I have a spare on board. The other one lasted the 9 years, so I think I got quite a bit of time. Well, you never know. Anyway, I'm going to rebuild that. And then the fuel injectors I had to have replaced, and I understand that you can rebuild them. I don't know if it's worth rebuilding them. I'm not that technical with stuff. The water pump, pretty easy. The price of rebuilding it is half the cost of buying a new one. Now I may need to get a new starter. Now I've replaced this one twice with a rebuild, and what's happening is when I go to start the boat, even like from the pier, just to get out, I'll push the start button. Nothing happens. I don't even get a click click. So I know it's not the batteries. Push it a couple more times, it'll eventually kick in. Now I've checked the wiring, made sure everything is connected right. I put a new starter switch in 2 years ago, and still had the same kind of issues. So I'm thinking for a few extra bucks, maybe I ought to just buy a new starter, eventually get this one rebuilt or rebuild it myself and have a spare. But the engine, to me, is important, especially when you really need it in bad weather. Of course, most of us use it to leave the slip and to get back into the slip, and even coming into a mooring. I know some of you guys are pretty darn good at this. You can sail in and get it done. I don't think I can do that. Now my fuel tank is 30 gallons. And that's quite a bit for a boat this size. I also have the jerry can, which you saw in the previous video, for an additional 5 gallons. Just for emergency's sake. We talked a little bit about the fuel tank. This didn't have a fuel gauge. Maybe at one time it did. It looked like it was hooked up for one, but it was gone. So I put a fuel gauge in. So now, and I calibrated that because it's an irregular tank, and I got a video on that. I'll put a link below for you. Pretty simple process. But the biggest thing I did, and I think was critical for this because the boat had sat for 15 years, is I drilled a 6-inch porthole or access panel in the fuel tank. You know, I got all the fuel out, I cleaned it out. Now this is on a diesel tank. I would not recommend this on a gas tank. Even if you get everything out of it, if there's any fumes and you have a spark, you got a big problem. But when I got that open, I had to take a scraper and get the gunk off the bottom of the tank. I mean, I was never going to just polish the fuel and get that thing to work. This was really worth the effort to put that in. Now you got to use a special sealant for it, one that is made for fuel tanks. So that's the basis on the power of things. Now power inside the boat, most of it is DC. That's why I have the 400 amp solar power or solar panels to help keep everything charged up. For example, the autopilot uses a fair amount of power, so that helps keep that keeps the battery charged. The stove, the propane stove, it's propane, but the solenoid operates off of DC power. All the lighting, the electronics, the chart plotter, the VHF radio, all of those things are DC. So when I got the boat, there wasn't a very big panel on it. And I've got again, I have a video on how I put the new DC power in. And then a little bit later, a couple years later, there's so much DC appliances anymore, I put a sub panel in. I probably didn't need to, but I didn't want to overload the one panel, so I put an additional DC panel in. You know, so it runs my Wi-Fi adapter and all of the other things that we mentioned. I'll show you the panel here. So when I got the boat, this was here. This was not here. This switch was down below. There was this AC panel, and there was a DC panel here about the size of my sub panel. So I put an additional AC panel in, shore power. I moved the battery charger up here. It was down here, I don't even remember where now. And then this is the Wi-Fi extender. But when I put this new panel in, I had to extend it a little bit to make everything fit properly. And from all of these things are from Paneltronics. They really do a nice job. So my idea for this panel, and then the VHF radio here, that sat over here somewhere. Now this is a little bit more convenient. It's a little hard to read it on the side here. I'm thinking of taking that out, mounting it up here, just putting it on a bracket and mounting it here. And then here is where I have a DC outlet where I can plug a adapter in here to go to AC. But here with the USB plugs to keep everything charged up, I use that for my tablet. But my thought has been to take all of this out, bring it out, make all of this flush, take the VHF, mount it in here where it's all enclosed, and it'll just look nicer. Functionality, this works just fine. So whether I make those changes, I know I'm not going to make those changes in 2024, but that's the overall plan for this panel. Now another issue I have though is battery space. This is where my battery compartment is. And right now I have two AGM 100 amp batteries in here, and they fit tight. My thought is if I cut this out here I might be able to turn these batteries and I can get at least one more, maybe two more in. The worst case is I would have to cut this and bring this out a couple of inches. But measuring it, looks like if I cut this right along here, I won't have to alter this part of the battery compartment. So before I get the inverter in place, I'm thinking I probably need to add that extra battery. May not need to. I could put the inverter in and just use it sparingly, but from the calculations I did on a spreadsheet, there's a lot of them out there on how to calculate how many amp hours and batteries you need. If I were to run everything, including the TV, the blender, a couple other little things, the microwave, I would need to have probably at least 3 batteries. Could get by with 2 and then every so often have to start the engine, but that's what I'm trying to avoid doing. So, you know, it's always a plan, a process, and getting there. Now, as far as electronics are concerned, I've got the basics, you know, the chart plotter, the VHF. I don't have a wind instrument, but I have a wind vane, and that's worked out fine. Now on the navigation part with the chart plotter, I use this most of the time, and just one of the software programs, and the tablet here is GPS enabled. It's bigger than my chart plotter. It's as accurate, but I like the chart plotter for 2 real big reasons. One, it's also my depth sounder. I have my depth sounder in there. I don't have a depth gauge. It's just on my chart plotter. And the chart plotter receives AIS when as I have it wired to my VHF. And again, I'll put a link below to the video I did on how to do that. On the bay, I turned off the proximity alarm because there's so many ships so close to you that it was constantly going off. Now I could set it for like a mile or maybe a little bit more. It would still be going off quite frequently. At night, that would probably be very important. I don't usually cruise at night, so during the day, as long as I don't fall asleep, I should be okay as it is. And that's another reason why I'd like to have radar, is sometimes I have to leave early in the morning to get to my next destination in the daylight, which I prefer to do, where the radar will pick up the smaller, or most of the smaller fishing vessels and other things that are out there that AIS isn't going to pick up. And I don't really need to have colored radar, you know, the gray screen. I just want to know something's out there. I don't need to know how pretty it is. I just want to know that it's there. Now, another thing with navigation, I have the autopilot, the Simrad autopilot, and that can hook up to the GPS as well and follow the course. I don't have it hooked up. I thought I did at one point, but I'm not that technical, so it didn't really work that well. Not because Simrad doesn't have it working well, I wasn't sure how to get it hooked up, and after messing around with it for a while, I said, hey, for what I do, I don't need it. When I get set on a course, I hit hold, and it keeps me on that course, whether I'm under power or under sail. Now, when you're under sail, you know, the wind shift a little bit, so just the auto follow sometimes can be a little tricky. I haven't had any real problems with it. You just have to keep an eye on it. The other thing I like to do on navigation though is keep the paper charts with me. And these are from NV Charts. And I had a set for the bay and I loaned them to someone. And I haven't seen them since. So I've got to pick up some new charts for the lower bay and the upper bay. One of the reasons I like to have well, two reasons. One, every so often the GPS will do a little bit of a glitch because we're a lot of military in the area. But two, you get a bigger picture of the overall area than you do on any kind of screen. I mean, just look at the difference in size, right? Of course you're going to get it. Yeah, I know you can zoom out and zoom out, but I have better resolution on this for the overall area than I would on this if I zoomed way out. And when I zoom way in, I get better resolution or better detail than I would on this. Still nice to have the paper charts though. Well, that kind of covers the basics of what I wanted to review today. And next week we're going to get more into the communications, more on the VHF. Of course, the cell phone, can't always rely on that either, especially out on the water. But we'll get into a little bit more of the communications and maybe a little bit more into some of the navigation on the Chesapeake Bay. Excuse me, guys. So until next time, happy and safe boating to you, your family, and friends.